our next panel. The internet is a tremendous resource that has changed everything about the way we live and work. And while it has revolutionized its world, it has also raised security challenges and First Amendment issues. Our government is struggling to protect itself from cyber attacks while also protecting free speech and preventing the online enabling of terrorist activity. This extraordinary panel of experts will discuss what responsibility tech companies have to fight terrorism and how tech companies should balance the demands of consumers and users and citizens with the demands of government. Wow, what an extraordinarily timely panel. This is great. Please help me in welcoming our experts, Mike Hermes, Brian Fishman, Megan Reese, and Michael Hayes.
All right, thank you all for joining us today to discuss fighting terrorism for technology. That was my only fear about this panel, is that I would say fighting technology with terrorism, and I didn't. Fighting terrorism with technology. Technology, particularly social media platforms, have become a ubiquitous part of our lives. You know, probably a lot of you saw this morning that Rex Tillerson lost his job. He found out the same way that you did. We use it to connect with our families. We use it to share photos. We use it to keep in touch with the world around us. Some of you have even built incredible businesses based on the power of social media and technology. Unfortunately, what makes it so attractive to you and I also makes it attractive to organizations that are trying to spread hateful messages, that are trying to create global terror networks. These are the sort of things that we're going to discuss today on this panel, how you and I and billions of users across the world can continue to enjoy everything that technology and social media has brought us, the rights, freedoms, privileges, while we also tackle the very serious issue of these platforms being used for hateful, destructive, and dangerous purposes. I think there's a balance there we can strike, and I think today this extraordinary panel of ours can help us suss out some of the ways that we can protect global security while preserving those rights and freedoms that all of us have come to cherish online. So first we have Megan Reese. Megan is with the R Street Institute, a free market think tank in Washington, D.C. She's a national security fellow there. Second, we have Brian Fishman with Facebook, head of counterterrorism public policy at Facebook. And last, we have Mike Hermes. Mike Hermes, until very recently, was the chief technology officer at the Department of Homeland Security. A lot of great perspectives here. I think we'll launch into a wonderful discussion that I'd like to start with Megan. When we're talking about extremist organizations and terrorist organizations co-opting these platforms that you and I are simply sharing photos of our family on, what exactly are they doing? How are they leveraging these platforms to spread their message?
Yeah, great question. Obviously, when you think about terrorism and technology, you're thinking of it from the front end and from the back end. So when we're talking about social media platforms, we're talking a lot about recruitment, getting people on board with terrorist ideology enough that they're going to want to actually join up a terrorist organization. So the big question going around DC right now, and I think it's spreading into Silicon Valley, as my colleague at Facebook is going to tell you later, is that DC wants to figure out what responsibility social media platforms have to combat this. So what steps do they need to take to make sure that these ideologies don't spread? And what steps could they take to counter those ideologies? So could they provide a counterpoint by upping different content to get those potential terrorists to go in a different direction?
And I would like to hear from you, Mike, from a government perspective as well. Similar assessment, is this where the major utilization and threats coming from extremist organizations online?
Yeah, so when we talk about online usage from extremist groups, you're absolutely right. Recruitment is a real problem. There's traditional recruitment where they're trying to get folks, into the actual network. But then the problem that's very, very scary and dangerous, particularly in the U.S., because we have secure borders. Despite what some people might think, our borders are actually quite strong relative to the European Union or other folks that are a little bit more open and don't have the geographic advantages we have. So self-radicalization or radicalization kind of in place for somebody that's already in the country is actually a really big problem. And that's where you've seen a lot of the domestic terror attacks have come from. So those people consume hateful propaganda online because that's the easiest place for them to get it. And so that's become a very effective tool for these folks to reach in, the extremist groups to reach into our physical space using the online space. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about how we combat that radicalization through social media.
And Brian, a little bit of a hot seat here. This is happening on your platform. When did Facebook first start to notice these radical elements, these extremist elements showing up on the platform? What were you able to do early on to combat that? And then how has that evolved? What's Facebook doing now to combat some of this stuff that unfortunately sounds like it's still happening?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I mean, I think it's important to contextualize how terrorists have used the internet for a long time. A lot of times we present this as if it's a new challenge, really because of the proximity that people in the media and others came to ISIS on Twitter in 2014, 2015, in that time period. But actually, Texas is sort of ground zero for terrorist use of the internet. The very first sort of digital propaganda space for a terrorist was set up by a guy named Louis Beam, an American white nationalist, in the mid-1980s. It was called White Aryan Liberty Net. And that sort of perspective, I think, is really, really important, that these kinds of bad actors have been using digital technology for decades, not years, to spread their messages. And the reason is they use the same technology as everybody else, as Michael said. And so from the Facebook perspective, I think it's really clear that terrorists have not been allowed to use the Facebook platform for years. That's been explicit in our terms of service. But I do think that we've gotten a lot more aggressive and better at finding and identifying this kind of content in recent years. And that's using a mix of human expertise and automated systems to identify that kind of content. And I'll save this for another answer, but it really requires a mix of those two things in order to do this well. Because as good as algorithms can be at surfacing potentially dangerous content, there is a lot of nuance here. And one of the risks, of course, is that we want to be very aggressive at taking down terrorist content, but we want to protect the ability of our users to speak, and to speak about controversial issues, and to speak sometimes in contentious ways. And so to make some of those nuanced calls, you really need human beings.
And that's a nuance I really want to get into here. And I'd like to have Megan give a little bit of perspective on that balance, the balance between the First Amendment expression that we all enjoy, and in fact many people globally now enjoy because of internet platforms, and the need to address these very serious issues that are happening online. Are companies and governments striking the right balance between those two issues with the current technologies they're using to combat extremist speech online?
Yeah, so the government and tech companies, I think, have the same end goal. They want to prevent the spread of terrorism. They want to prevent self-radicalization. They want to prevent their companies from being associated with something that's bad. And so that's a great starting point, is that we all have the same end goal. Probably the problem right now is that actually less from the terrorism side and more from the state-sponsored misinformation, fake news side.
And we'll definitely get to
we'll
more of that in a little bit.
The government is coming to this assessment that tech companies aren't doing enough. And the problem with the government coming to this conclusion and thinking that they need to take the steps to address it is that they're going to start creating mandates that could potentially actually hinder some of these free speech rights that we have, the right to have these hard discussions online, to spread information online. And so my fear is that the right balance is not going to be struck unless tech companies kind of create this pathway to doing as much as they can while protecting these. Otherwise, government's going to get involved, and I don't really see that going super well.
Mike, are tech companies doing enough?
Well, so look, let me give you my perspective on this. Now, I no longer represent the federal government, so this is my perspective. But I was living in Manhattan for 9/11. I was there. Actually, got married 3 days after 9/11, so it was kind of a personal time. And I remember thinking, and our honeymoon was supposed to be 5 days after, and travel was disrupted, and we were going far, far away, and everybody was kind of anxious that we would do that after this had happened. And I remember thinking, it is when we change our way of life, that the terrorists have won, right? That's when they have won. Not, obviously killing innocents is horrific, but if they really win, if they change our way of life. And the same thing applies here when we're trying to combat terrorism online. If by combating it and fixing some of these problems, we change our way of life and limit the free speeches that we have, that we enjoy that others don't, then they will have won similarly. So we have to find that balance. I believe it's not that just that, and there are more things tech companies can do, but there's a hell of a lot more things government can do. So, we all need to do better about trying to combat this problem while maintaining that balance.
But I think it's really key to understand that from the tech perspective, we understand government has the ultimate responsibility for protecting citizens. They're obviously interested and want to understand how we're approaching these problems and have a lot to contribute to our understanding of the nature of the problem in itself. So we actually really want that kind of engagement. We want to learn from what government experts are seeing, how we can get better. We think that's really, really valuable because we see what's on our platforms. And in reality, the way that terrorism manifests in the world, some of it happens online, a lot of it happens offline. And governments are going to have much better signal on those kinds of dynamics than we are. We do our best to keep up with those things so we can get ahead of some of the new trends online, but we need that engagement so that we can learn from where government is coming from on these sorts of things. Just a perspective on the sort of the free speech angle. I mean, because my perspective here is, look, the free speech angle is really, really important, but there is another issue here, which is we need to be as effective as we can be at preventing terrorists from using the internet. And that is a very, very dynamic problem. The way that terrorists do this changes all the time. The way that our algorithms work change all the time because we're trying to keep up with a metastasizing problem. And what I worry about is because the goal, we all share the same goals, but if we get into a position where we are fixed on a single metric or we are fixed on a single approach, we are going to wind up behind the curve on the way that bad actors are actually manifesting on the platform. We have to be able to be dynamic enough to try to keep up with them and do our best to get ahead of them. And that's my biggest fear when we talk about regulation is not that it's not going to be well-intentioned. It's going to be well-intentioned. I think we are also already aggressively pursuing these sorts of things. We can work together on those goals. What I worry about is unintentionally creating counterproductive incentives over the long run.
And just to hop in on your point, there was a bill going through at least the House side, possibly the Senate side this fall, on regulating the Internet of Things in order to prevent bad things from happening. And in a lot of ways, it made so much sense. We want companies to increase their cybersecurity standards so bad things can't happen. The problem with the bill, in my opinion, was it created a standard and it would create this incentive for companies to not go beyond that standard. And it would be set in stone, which means that for a long time, bad actors would be innovating to get around those standards, and companies wouldn't have that many incentives because they were already meeting their legal obligations. And I will, to give a shout out to DHS, they have something called the NIST framework. I have no idea what NIST stands for.
National Institute of Science and Technology, or
Yes,
Standards and Technology? Standards.
It creates a standard setting regime instead of this legally mandated floor for cybersecurity standards. And it did it so that, for instance, infrastructure would be more protected from terrorists. And I think that standard setting is a lot better approach than creating regulation that would lower the incentive to continue innovating.
Ryan, I want to make sure that when we're talking about doing something, people understand what doing something means. And so to the extent that you can, shine a little bit of light on what Facebook is doing. Is it algorithms? Is it humans? Is it a combination? How are you day-to-day combating this stuff on your platform?
Sure. So just at a high level, the policy is that terrorists can't use Facebook, right? That's obviously easier said than done. But that means terrorists can't use Facebook to send pictures of cats or puppies or whatever else. Like if we understand that you are a terrorist in the real world, it does not matter what you're doing on Facebook, you are not allowed to use the platform. Now, To enforce that policy is obviously the hard part. We have about 180 people at Facebook whose primary job is dealing with terrorism, right? So, which is a lot. And that doesn't include the, 7,500, now going up towards 20,000 people that actually review content more generally and come across terrorist content and escalate it to the specialist teams. So there is a big effort internally to do that. Now, one of the challenges here is that terrorists can't use Facebook, but there are unique circumstances in which terrorist content can be on the platform. For example, if it is shared in the context of the media. We see this a lot, where we use automated image and video matching to identify terrorist content, and it turns out that it's in a Vox article or a Daily Mail article or whatever it is from around the world. We don't want to kill that content automatically. Right? And so this is, I think, illustrates the mix. We also don't want to kill counter speech. Oftentimes we see people, share a video from ISIS or National Action or whatever it may be and say, can you believe what these people are doing? We have to stand against them. We don't want to eliminate that. We want to allow that kind of speech. But what we do with the algorithms, at least, is we'll use image and video matching. Winds up being really critical. We used a variety of text classifiers to understand posts and text that we have removed in the past to surface content that we want to take a look at in the future. We don't trust that well enough that we would allow it to make an automated action. We would put that in front of a human being. And we do a lot of work, because you can imagine what happens when we remove people's accounts, right? What do? They try to create new accounts. And so we do a lot of work to try to catch those as they come back. Right, and understand immediately when they come back so that we can take them down again. And in some cases, our detection there is good enough that we allow it to act automatically. In other circumstances, when our confidence isn't as high, we put it in front of a human being. But that's an area where you really see the dynamic stuff, right? Is our algorithms, you'll see it. They'll start to work really well, and then they'll start to work less well. Right? And that's because the behavior of the bad actors changes. And so we have to tweak those algorithms over time. And so it's very, very difficult to just say, well, I'm going to snap my fingers, there's one solution. It is a fight. It is a back and forth process. And if we don't understand it as a dynamic sort of engagement like that, we're missing the boat.
So I just want to highlight something that I think is critical that foot stomps what both of you referred to, which is the dynamic nature of the threat and the challenge, and the fact that typically laws, regulations, policy, and government in general are not dynamic, right? They're not well adapted to changing circumstances, things that change quickly. And that is a real challenge in this issue, but it's actually a much bigger, broader challenge in government adapting to the changing world circumstances that we have. And when I think about fighting terror with tech,
make sure we get that one right.
Yeah, at DHS, for example, that fundamental challenge is one of the things we're trying to confront. How does an organization that is rigid and not well adapted to change confront rapidly evolving and changing threat environment, where they have to apply technology in an ever-increasing, capacity to confront those threats. And so we have to fix the machine to be able to change more rapidly to confront these threats, these rapidly escalating threats. And it goes for the online realm, and it goes for how we use technology to enable our law enforcement, our counterterrorism folks, our military folks. And it's a similar challenge. It's really, really important.
So we've got a complete picture of what doing something means. I want to hear a little bit more about the government perspective. What does doing something on the government side mean? Are you sharing information constantly with platforms like Facebook as you learn about new extremist organizations, content strategies they might be using? Where's your role, and particularly where's the interface with the platforms that may be hosting this stuff and need a little bit of help from the government, who has the best eyes on these organizations?
Well, so we definitely want to and try to share information as much as possible, and Brian would probably know better how effective he thinks the government is at sharing information. But certainly, again, starting with the intent is to enable these folks to help us, right, or to help us help them. We all have the same goal. But for us doing something, it does mean exactly that. It means, mostly we're trying to just stop bad things from happening, right? That's kind of our goal. And so policing the internet, so to speak, right, is just a means to an end of stopping bad things to happen. Like, we don't have an interest in you know, arbitrating speech on the internet per se. We really don't want to be in that business at all. I'm sure Facebook doesn't really want to be that business either. But we do all want to stop bad things from happening. So we're looking at how can we identify folks who might be on the path to self-radicalization so we can be aware of them at the very least and try to mitigate issues. How can we, you know, identify, obviously, actual terrorists, you know, from doing bad things in the country or elsewhere. So a lot of it for us is about visibility and identifying anomalies, if you will, using the data that's available. And all these platforms throw off a tremendous amount of data, right? And we don't have, you know, we never will have, for obvious reasons, full access to all that. But there is a collaboration that needs to occur there.
Well, Megan, something was brought up right there at the very end, and that's access to data going from the platform side to the government side. Do you see that as striking the right balance between security and personal ownership of data privacy issues, or do you think that there's a bit of an off balance there?
That's an easy question. Look, I think in the next couple years, probably sooner than I would predict, there's going to be the creation of public-private partnerships to deal with these issues. And it's going to come with intermediaries, because I don't think either side 100% trusts. Like, the government side is a little wary of tech.
Comment on that in a minute.
Yeah.
Tech is a little wary of government, and I think there's going to be a creation of a lot of intermediaries. And there does need to be an understanding of the protection of private data during this. But I think the bigger question right now is who those intermediaries are going to be to create this that are going to help facilitate the movement of information across these two groups. And you're going to see Congress trying to address it. You're going to see think tanks in DC and Silicon Valley try to address it. And who is going to be successful, I'm not quite sure yet who that's going to be.
I think there's a couple of efforts that are worth pointing to in particular. One is an industry effort called the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, which we tried to call GIFCT, and everyone hates the acronym, so the forum. But what that does is it codifies kind of informal meetings that have gone on for years between tech companies, mostly the larger tech companies, historically primarily in Silicon Valley, talking about how you approach terrorism issues. And this kind of informal sharing among industry is actually really important on these issues. What we've done since last summer is codify that in the larger platforms in conjunction with a group called Tech Against Terrorism, which is a UN-sponsored NGO, have put out some best practices, some learnings from some of the larger companies. Because here's what's happening, right? I'm from Facebook, I'm here in this room talking about this. But what's happening is that the larger platforms are getting better at this. We are not perfect. We really are not perfect, but we really are getting better. And I would say that across all the big platforms. What's going to start to happen, and what's already starting to happen, is that we are displacing this content to smaller platforms that have less capability to deal with it, right? And so in a sense, that is a good thing, right? Because we are making our environments more inhospitable to these bad actors. At the same time, we're pushing it off into places where they don't have the ability to hire 180 people to deal with this kind of issue. And so how do we deal with that? So GIFCT is designed, well, you know, many of these small platforms don't even know, like, how do I develop terms of service? You get 4 engineers who build something that's not where their head's at, right? They're trying to pay the bills and keep the lights on and do the technical work to make things work. So we want to give them some of that up front. We're also producing something called this hash sharing consortium, where we are hashing. A hash is like a digital fingerprint of a file. We are hashing images and videos from essentially formal propaganda from terrorist organizations, and we are sharing that where small company, and we're also sharing a variety of technology so they can use that hash, so that they can understand and look for terrorist content on their own platforms. So there's 13 companies signed up so far. We want more. If any of you are from companies that would want to be involved, come talk to me afterwards. But this is the kind of thing where I think you start to see industry trying to produce both guidelines for folks that are trying to innovate, but also some real practical tools so that they can enforce and identify terrorist content on their own platforms more effectively. None of this is perfect. This is not a panacea. Like, there is no panacea. But it's an effort. I think it's an important one. And we think it's making progress.
Mike, you think some of these intermediary-based efforts, industry-based efforts, are these a step in the direction that we need to be going? Do you view them as adequate to assess the severity of the threat?
Well, nothing's adequate to assess the severity of the threat. That's the reality. I mean, you know, unfortunately. So we have to keep pushing the envelope there. But I know, I absolutely think this is right on target. The government cannot do this alone. As we alluded to earlier, we can't move fast enough yet, and maybe never. I really hope we get there, because we have to start being more agile, nimble, and agile in the truest sense of the word. But things like those industry groups to help lift all the boat, so to speak, in those on those platforms is critical. I think actually something like, and I'm sure there's practical challenges to this, but a free API that that Facebook or Google could host that would actually spit out some rating of the content, so these smaller platforms don't have to develop it on their own, would be awesome, right? We're never going to be able to do that. I shouldn't say never, but it's much harder for us to do that. So I think this is absolutely the right direction.
The other thing that GiveCT does is it creates a forum where we have folks from governments come in to talk, to brief on, and that winds up being valuable. It's valuable for us, but it's also valuable for the smaller companies that don't have the expertise. They also don't have the lawyers to tell them where to draw the line on engagement with government. And as a result, they wind up being very, very cautious about any engagement. So we want to create a forum where you can have like appropriate engagement, where government can say, hey guys, there's this new trend, you need to be aware of it, and we can get that information out to people.
Yeah, and there's an incentive for companies to, although they have the end goal of not wanting their forums to be used poorly by bad actors, there's an incentive to maybe not always tell the government what's going on, because you don't want government to step in and do something that inhibits your ability to continue to run your company. So making sure that there's an appropriate way to do this without scaring the companies from sharing data or sharing bad things going on is really, really necessary.
Yeah, that's very similar in the cyber realm, right? Like, companies don't like to share bad things happening to them. That makes it hard to share threat indicators and indicators of compromise and things like that. Similar problem.
I think we have to do a better job. I think this is an area where we have to do a better job. And we have to do a better job to reassure, most importantly, reassure our users, but also reassure government stakeholders that are thinking about their citizens. And that's something we are thinking about and working on.
So before we wrap up today, I want to make sure that we don't just touch on terrorism, but that we also mention nation states, because certainly there's been a little bit of news out there about nation states using technology and social media platforms in ways that are potentially threatening to our government or our citizenry. How are the actions of nation states in some ways similar to the usage of these terrorist organizations that we've been describing? And in what ways are they very unique and specific threats that require separate tools to tackle? I would love to hear first from Facebook about how you differentiate these kind of threats and how you apply different tools to tackling them.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think this actually differs depending on the platform you're talking about. On Facebook, I think one of the similarities that we have seen is that you get use of inauthentic accounts that are not bots, that look like people, in a much more real sense. Yep. And I think that's tricky. Now, the nice thing that we have at Facebook is it violates our policy and has always, from the very beginning, violated our policies to have an inauthentic account. And so that provides us a basis for removing both terrorist-y content and nation-state related content. But I think, it's very easy for us. We have a blanket prohibition against any use of the platform by terrorists. And the content itself, I mean, the terrorists usually want you to know exactly who they are, ultimately. Not in every case, but most of the time, at least the way that manifests on Facebook. That's not the case with some of the state actors, obviously, right? They're presenting themselves as legitimate political movements and distributing content that in some cases were it shared in a different context would be allowed. And so that makes it a harder problem in my mind. And so we've taken a little bit of a different approach, right? We've got this, in many cases, we enforce our authenticity policies. We're trying to give users more context to understand what they see so that they can make judgments about who is sending an ad, right? Who is sponsored an ad. Make judgments about articles, right? What other kinds of articles has this page published? We're serving up information that suggests, one of the changes that didn't get a lot of attention but that I think is really creative is serving up more local news. And then we're experimenting with ways to sort of validate that local users, that users commenting on that are actually local to the place that the news story is about, right? This kind of stuff I think is, we don't know if it's gonna work, right? I mean, that's the thing, is these are novel problems. We are experimenting our way through them to try to resolve them. I think we need to do a better job of being transparent about those efforts, both what works, what doesn't work. But to say that, what I think is really key though is that we are facing this challenge that is a societal problem, and we all have to approach it like we are looking for solutions. That's happening internally. I think we need to do a better job talking about that struggle and what's difficult about it. Because I think, let's break down the fourth wall, right? I think one of the challenges here is we haven't always done a great job of expressing how hard this stuff is and sort of owning when we try things and they don't work, right? That happens all the time. And that's to be totally expected. And the flip side of that is we need to explain that, and that needs to land in a way where people recognize the good intentions of those efforts. And that's the way forward, is more transparency from us and sort of a recognition of that from everyone else.
And once that happens, once there is a recognition, you'll see the movement towards what we're seeing today. So there was an article in Science this week, I guess, on fake news. And it was a collection of scientists, lawyers, a bunch of different folks, sociologists, who are just talking about the problem and saying that this is a problem the science community can start to address. And so I think we're starting to see that it's not just a government response, it's not just a tech company response, it's not just an NGO or a think tank response, it's pretty much a whole society response in order to figure out how to make a citizenry that's more capable of evaluating the information that they're intaking. And it's really, really tough. It's really tough, and I do not, I wouldn't want to be in his position.
So Mike, I would love to go to you. One of the big tenets of the technology space is your failure in the pursuit of a grand and bigger success. That is not often a government tenet. In order to tackle some of these enormous existential problems, it's going to take moonshot ideas. How do we incorporate that into the government's assessment and action on these issues, with also recognizing that these are life or death situations? How do we balance those, make the government a little bit more nimble, but also make sure that we maintain a focus and a grounding in reality of to what kind of problems we're dealing with here?
Well, first, I think we have to make the government a lot more nimble, not a little bit more nimble, and I think that's one of the things that I've spent a lot of time working on, and we need a lot of help with that. And I'm going to come back to that in a second because it is important, but I just want to reinforce something that without minimizing the severity of the problem with like online extremist groups and how they leverage technology, because it is a problem. It is much easier problem to solve than, Brian is absolutely right, the issue of disinformation from nation states is an incredibly difficult challenge, primarily because as Brian said, the terrorist groups, they're effectively using the platforms the way they were meant to be used, but with really awful content, right? Trying to do propaganda, a digital marketing campaign, if you will, and a community building effort around horrible things. it's easier to identify that. The nation-state actors are perverting the platforms. They're manipulating the platforms in ways that they, were designed to circumvent and confuse and deliver disinformation. It's much harder to figure that out, but it's also I think, ultimately much more dangerous. It does have true implications across all of society, particularly democratic society. And again, if you look at what's happened and what's surfaced, and I'm sure Facebook doesn't like talking about this, but half of the U.S. population was exposed to ads, or content, that was ultimately seeded by, adversarial nation states, in the last election cycle. That's amazing, right? In a bad way. The fact is that we have not come to a solution as to how to prevent that from happening again. We don't know how to stop that from happening. So I want to foot stomp. That's incredibly important, and everybody has to work together to solve that. In terms of government, being able to, whether it's moonshots or be more agile, I think they need both, right? They need some big, bold ideas to try to solve these giant problems with the help from industry, because they absolutely need that. But really, more than anything, they need to be able to move more quickly. They need to be able to take risks that fail, right? The government is not well adapted to failure, right? Because folks are very risk averse. One of my senior leaders at DHS, one of my favorite all-time public servants, he was the Undersecretary for Management at DHS, and he talks about how we need to encourage folks taking productive risks, taking risks that advance our learning. It's okay. It should be encouraged and rewarded if you fail doing that. Not rewarding failure because you were incompetent or because you did something wrong, right, or you were wasteful or fraudulent. But if you took a risk that advanced our learning and understanding and failed, that should be rewarded, right? And the government is very bad at doing that. So rewarding that risk-taking, productive risk-taking, along with changing lots of processes that we have to become more nimble, to react to changing circumstances more effectively, those are foundational to our ability to confront any and all threats that we face going forward.
Yeah.
And we're working a lot on that.
And on the government is not good at this, coming from the congressional side, there is every incentive to not develop laws and policies that help these organizations, DHS, DOD, the IC, et cetera, become more capable of addressing issues. There's one thing in particular. I was helping with the NDAA process in my old office, and that's the bill that funds the military. And we tried to create an innovative amendment to help with cyber issues. And what we got was they came back to us and said, well, if you get it, then DHS should get it, and this government agency should get it, and that government agency should get it. And so we went to each of those, and they said, that's a really interesting idea. And we said, do you want it? And they're like, not right now. And so we're like, can we go through and try to push this? And they're like, no. So we weren't allowed to have it because they didn't want it at the moment, and it prevented innovation at the DoD level.
No one talked to me about that. I want that.
Yes. But government's structured to keep things from changing very quickly, and it's structured like that for a reason. But when we face these constantly evolving challenges, it doesn't go super well.
And both Brian and Mike, are there concrete steps that government agencies or Congress, if necessary, can take to try to improve this situation, that can try to incentivize some of this cooperation, innovation, failure for the sake of a common good? Are there ways that we can effectively and possibly even easily incentivize that behavior?
Easily. I don't know about easily. I think you saw some efforts. There's so many angles to this problem, but you saw some efforts around sharing of cyber information, to kind of indemnify folks and, kind of hold folks, so you couldn't come after them for sharing that information. There are things like that we can do, but I think it comes back to an earlier point about the unintended consequences of policy, regulation, and law, and we're just not very good at, because things are changing so rapidly and they're so complicated, we're not good at fully digesting what all the consequences of these kinds of policies and laws might be. So you have to be that's one of the reasons it takes time, because you have to be very careful about not doing something that actually makes you think you're helping, but you make the problem worse. I do think transparency in general is a really good thing. I think that overall, if there's one theme, one thing that we can do to kind of continue to make progress that everybody should agree on, is that more transparency is generally better. Not everybody, though, is in favor of that for a number of reasons, and sometimes transparency comes with a cost. And for example, if you think about the Honest Ads Act, I think you were going to talk about that, where you provide more transparency on who's buying what kind of ads and why, and who they're targeting. Some of the digital advertising folks, legitimate digital advertising folks, are like, well, you're making my life a whole lot more difficult, now to do this, and there's cost associated with that.
I think, I think for the Facebook perspective, we are interested in things like the digital or the Honest Ads Act, but we aren't waiting for government to push these things. And we've already rolled out sort of tests in Canada that would provide more transparency into what ads people a page on Facebook is buying. We intend to roll that out in the United States over the summer. So I think that's our approach on this, is we want to shape some of the governmental efforts, but we're not going to wait on them because ultimately we understand that we have a responsibility to our community, to our users, to do the right thing by them. And this conversation helps that, but if we can act more quickly, we're not going to wait. I think one of the big things, and I think, even in this conversation, we have these conversations in the US, and oftentimes the discussion becomes very, very US-centric. But one of the core places, and I think we've slipped into that a little bit here, so I just want to break it, which is, oftentimes when it comes to providing data, one of the things we hear from foreign governments oftentimes is when they request data about a legitimate terrorist threat in the world, right? We provide a transparency report where we explain how we respond to those, but that takes a long time because of the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty. So it has to go through the British Ministry of Justice, to their foreign ministry, to the State Department, to the Department of Justice, which processes it. Then it comes to us. We provide the information that goes all the way back through that loop in some cases, right? That winds up really pissing off the British government for reasons, because it takes a long time. It's not actually a holdup on our end, but those kinds of processes wind up really slowing things down. And I think from our perspective, we only want governments to be upset with us when there's actually a legitimate disagreement. And in some cases, that is not the case, where they've requested something, we think it's appropriate to give it to them, and it still takes a long time because of the process. And those are places where I think we could make headway.
Yeah.
So, one last quick thought, and I want to make sure that our audience has time to ask a few questions. But I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, my thought? Oh, awesome.
No, not a thought for everyone, only because you'd already started your thought.
One other thing that I think that government in the US could do better is we are not the first country to be targeted through misinformation campaigns from Russia. Eastern European countries have been dealing with it since at least 2007 and even prior, but through these platforms. And we can learn from what they've been trying in order to deal with these issues, both in Eastern and Western Europe. And they've been trying a lot of different things, some of which we would not want to do because they're more willing to constrain their internet than we are, and I think it's good that we don't want to move in that direction, but we can learn from them, and I think we need to have a lot more dialogues with our European counterparts to figure out what they're doing, what's going well and what's going poorly, and see if we can replicate some of those initiatives over here.
All right, I want to open it up to audience questions now. Okay, we'll go right here, the woman in the front, black blazer.
Brian, you mentioned that you were trying to be careful to preserve terror content in the context of news media. And then Megan, I believe it was you that said, especially when someone is reposting and saying, what these guys are doing is bad. And I just want to offer two quick counter arguments to that, because I am curious if what I'm going to say comes up in your office and how you guys decide to work through that. But since Facebook is sort of in the business of deciding what news we do and don't see, obviously a lot of terrorism happens because they're trying to get into the news cycles. They're trying to radicalize from being in the news cycles. And then the flip side is that when white Americans repost that content, it's often really aggressively targeted in how it's negative, and it creates dangerous situations for women that wear hijabs and commute on a public bus. We've got people walking into bars, shooting people with turbans that aren't even Muslim, and it makes no sense. So sometimes the terror content, even if it's been put out by NBC, isn't always helpful to the discourse. Is that something you guys talk about, think about, address?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and I think it's a fair question. It's obviously a challenge, though, that we want our platform to be a place for, I mean, look, we could have a whole other discussion about Facebook and the news media, right? But we want our platform to be a place where media can get a message out, can explain the world, to create the debate, to create a healthier democracy. And there are very rare cases where there are certain things that it doesn't matter how it's shared. Things like bomb-making videos, bomb-making instructions, gore, things like that. There is no context in which we allow it. But we do want to allow the media to explain some of these dynamics of bad actors in the world. And that responsibility is not just on us. It's in newsrooms around the country where editors and reporters need to make these decisions as well. And I agree completely that there needs to be a conversation, a wider conversation there about this. When you talk about the sort of white supremacist and some of the Islamophobic attacks, those also very much violate our terms of service and are removed when we identify them.
I think we have time for probably 2 more audience questions. Gentleman here in the middle, plaid shirt.
Thank you. Hi, I'm a French journalist, so my question will be, will have a more European touch. It's for Mr. Fishman. The European Commission has recently asked you guys, social media companies, to speed up their takedown process and take down terrorist content under 1 hour after flagging. And they also threaten to take a legislation kind of move if you don't. My question is twofold. First, how far are you from that 1 hour target? And how would you welcome any legislation? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. There is nobody in the European Union who wants to catch this material faster than I do. And I will always be more unsatisfied than even parliamentarians in Brussels. That said, the 1 hour turnaround time is very well intentioned, but it has the potential to create negative consequences. For example, we have normal processes to try to catch newly input material, right? And we're trying to do that very, very quickly. We also have processes to try to go back and identify old material that's been there for a long, long time. Nobody's asking us to do that. We're going to do that because it's the right thing to do. But I worry, is the European Commission going to punish us for doing the right thing by going back and finding material that was perhaps uploaded years and years ago before people really recognized this problem? And that's the conversation we need to have with the Commission. That's why it really needs to be a back and forth, and that's an example of where really well-intentioned regulation could actually create counterproductive incentives.
All right, one
but
more
I
question.
recognize speed matters, and they're right to focus on speed.
Rachel Wolbers in the back.
So I work for Engine Advocacy, and we represent startups and small companies. And so I was really encouraged to hear the work that you guys are doing to include the smaller platforms who are seeing a lot of this material. And I have a lot of startups who tell me, you know, I found either revenge porn or something suspicious on my platform, and they're not exactly sure who in the government that they should be talking to. And I'm wondering if you have any recommendations.
Yes, we should talk after. Let's talk after about that one. But absolutely, you should talk to me on the terrorist stuff, and I can put you in touch with the right people on some of the other issues.
Mike, any perspective on that as well?
No, look, I think unfortunately the government's a vast labyrinth to navigate. So it's hard. I think if you can find folks in the community who've done it, that's a good course. I will say that the government in general is trying to find ways to work with smaller companies more effectively. I think both to leverage their technology and the innovation that they bring to bear and in problems like this and every other problem. And also find ways to get those communication channels more widely known so folks can figure out who to talk to. We still have a long way to go, unfortunately.
And specifically, there is a group within FBI that deals with cybercrime, and it has a reporting thing online that your friends could go to and report what's going on. But I don't think very many people even know that exists, and that's also a problem that the government needs to deal with and make sure that the relevant stakeholders know what to do if something goes wrong.
Since that one was quick, we will do one more audience question, but you have to promise that it is a very quick question. So if it's not a quick question, don't raise your hand.
72 parts.
Back, brown shirt there. Yes, you.
Hi, thanks so much. My name is Susanna Cunningham, and I'm from a group called Only Through Us that works on the way that we react, society and policymaking, after an attack, a terror attack. So I do have a question. You know, there's this quote that says it's impossible to disentangle the reaction to an attack from the attack. There are always two parties in every attack because these terror networks are looking to elicit a reaction. In what way are your organizations trying to work on not just the attack and the use of your online platform, but also the way that we all react, government and society?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think, you know, we run through. We should have a much longer conversation about this, but. In the wake of an attack, we do a variety of things. One, we look very closely to see if we can find it. Did the attacker have a presence on Facebook? Is there something there that's relevant to law enforcement that we need to provide? We try to make sure that there isn't praise for an attacker in those settings, which does happen in some cases, and we remove that. That violates our terms. We also do take a lot of steps to try to protect the victims and their families. We memorialize pages. We will remove them if their families want. And in many cases, that is a deeply, deeply personal decision about how people want to react to the victims of these sorts of things. But frankly, this is a place where I'd love your input. Like, what's the better way for us to create a forum for people to react productively in the wake of an attack? I think we could do more and we could do better.
And I would say, of course, from the government's perspective, clearly the focus in the wake of an attack is on trying to understand if there's an additional threat or threats, you know, in the wake of an attack, and that's a very significant focus, as well as then, you know, forensics and understanding what happened, why, who, when. Again, also to kind of seed out larger networks. So unfortunately, you know, that takes up the vast majority of mind share from the government's response and how we view in the wake of those attacks. Having said that, you know, leaders and folks, you know, do often try to take pains to, you know, understand how this impacts their communities that are impacted, and not to make matters worse, you know, in terms of, you know, Islamophobia or other things that might happen in the wake of attacks. But it's hard because, again, that focus on, you know, finding the bad guy and stopping more bad guys is really where the focus of the government does need to be, quite frankly. So.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think we're going to see something else happening. I think we're going to see nation-state actors, at the moment it's Russia, trying to sow additional discord in the wake of an attack, which means that you're going to see movement of bots and actors behind fake accounts trying to get into these national conversations and divide us as much as possible. And so I think that between the government and tech companies, they'll probably need to develop a stronger partnership to figure out when that's happening or share information if they recognize it.
We've already seen it, right? We've already started to see that.
The Parkland shooting.
Well, thank you all for joining us. I hate to end on a downer, but I really appreciate you all joining us today for this panel.
Thanks, Megan.
And before we applaud the panel, though, I do have a quick public service announcement for you all, and that is that there is dessert downstairs for 30 minutes. And after the dessert and your last opportunity to try Intel's VR goggles downstairs, we will be hosting a follow-up on our discussion from IPD last year with our staff Tiffany Moore and a great panel discussing tech in the Trump administration. So you won't want to miss that. But now I do want to applaud this extraordinary panel that we had here today.
Thank you.